Okay, so we come to the Christian era now. Um, we left off with Epicurus. Um, there's one other more important thinker to talk about who definitely influenced the thinking, especially in Rome, prior to Christianity becoming more and more widespread, and that's Plotinus. So I might say something quick about him. But anyway, we've looked at these different pictures of the best life for the human being. We start with Socrates. He claims that he doesn't know what the best life for the human being is. He doesn't know what the self is or the best technique for the self. He's looking for the answers to these questions. We looked at Plato and we read the Gorgias and we looked at some of the answers given in the Republic for Plato. The main picture there is that arete, that is virtue as excellence, is the best life for a human being. Just like some craft, like a pot from a potter, can be both beautiful and have utility through the exercise of the craft. So the human life can be something like a craft that it's worked on, it's perfected, it has something that's both enviable in the sense of its beauty and its function. Um, and so forth. Then we looked at Antisthenes, and Antisthenes says the best life for the human being involves autocratia, self-rule, autonomy, self-sufficiency, courage, and he thinks the way to get these kind of things is through the simple life. Um, and then the Stoics, keeping in mind that Zeno was first a cynic, um, give us that picture of tranquility um, as the best life for the human being. Tranquility is ataraxia in Greek, also almost inexchangeably used with the word apatheia, which we see in Evagrius Ponticus. He uses the same word over and over again, pretty much the same as the Stoics, but with a somewhat slight different twist on it. But the notion of dispassion is very important to both the Stoics and Evagrius Ponticus. Um, and as we already saw, Epicurus's notion is hedonism, but sophisticated hedonism, not foolhardy pictures of pleasure. Um, so, like I think I said before, the Stoic school and the Epicurean schools were the two most popular schools in the Hellenistic era. But near the end of the century or whatever, as we start to get into the Common Era, uh, there's this rise of Neoplatonism, largely through the influence of Plutarch and other people, but through Plotinus. Um, and Plotinus is without a doubt a very spiritual thinker, but he's a Platonist. So when we get to Christianity, we get this spiritual picture of the best life for the human being. Um, it's no longer excellence like in Plato. It's no longer self-sufficiency and courage and strength and so forth like in the Cynics. It's no longer manipulating states of consciousness for the power of mind and tranquility in the Stoics. It's no longer about pleasure. These are all self-related techne. Um, when we get to the spiritual notion, how a person achieves the highest life for the human being is related to our relation to God. So it's external to ourselves alone. Um, and Plotinus already had this view, and he popularized this spiritual philosophy in Neoplatonism. And he both influences St. Augustine, who's without a doubt the first framer of Christianity, has a tremendous influence, but also Evagrius Ponticus himself, largely through the writings of Origen and so forth, is very much influenced by Neoplatonism. So I'd say a few words about that. Plotinus was born in Alexandria, which was the city of learning, had the biggest library in the Western world at the time. He went to various schools, but was unsatisfied with everything he found until he came to this one teacher named Ammonius. Now, Ammonius is said to be the teacher as well of Origen, so this is important. They came from the same teacher, both Origen and Plotinus. Um, Ammonius eventually dies, and he tells Plotinus that if he wants to know the real essence of what he's been taught over these years with him, he should go to India and learn these sort of esoteric teachings there. Um, and so Plotinus goes with this excursion through the military that was going over there and does go to India and barely makes it back, but does come back. He's 40 years old when he returns to the West and comes to Rome. Uh, and he sets up there, but not in any sort of typical way. He had this magnetic personality, and people were just impressed with his person and his loving kindness and his sort of spiritual quality. And so people would just let him stay in their houses. And he had these very wealthy people and so forth that would let him stay in their villas and whatever. Not that he cared very much about who let him stay where. And he would give these informal talks to people, mostly in houses. For a while, he did seem to have a small place that he gave lectures at. And he teaches this very mystical but Platonist picture of spirituality. So, I mean, I think, to put it in contemporary terms, what he did was he took ideas that were already in Plato but are kind of veiled in poetry and imagery and myth and so forth. And then he gave them a more concrete backing from probably what he got from both Ammonius and his trip to India, which I think in today's terms we could call Vedanta. Vedanta is essentially the philosophy that is encompassed in the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. A very complicated philosophy if you know anything about this, but anyway, he teaches basically a fusion of these two schools of thinking in Eastern Indian philosophy with Platonism, which people are already aware of, and makes Platonism more specific and so forth. Anyway, I wouldn't go into all the details here, but it's extremely fascinating and extremely detailed. And so what he does is he takes the notion of excellences in Plato and he magnifies them basically up towards notions of meditation. So in Plato, we already talked about the education model, and Plato says that you can get all the way up to viewing the form of the good. And he talks about the cave analogy and gives all these myths and stuff in various dialogues, but he's never specific about like how do you actually do this. We have this letter from Plato that we think is authentic. It's called the Seventh Letter, and in it he says that he has esoteric teachings that he gives to certain students but no one else, which may have been kind of meditative practices. But anyway, Plotinus specifically starts giving details of these practices. And so the works that he wrote are called the Enneads, which just means the nine. And it's huge. If you go look at it in the Gonzaga Library, it's thousands of pages. It's huge. And the other interesting thing about it is that he wasn't at all interested in writing them. He didn't care about that, but his students would ask him to write down things that he'd said in his lecture. And so Porphyry, his student who collected all these writings, said that he would literally just sit down and that in one jet he would just put his pen down on the papyri scroll and he would just write the whole thing from A to Z, set down the pen and hand it to Porphyry. He didn't care. He wasn't trying to become famous or anything. He does become famous, but that was not his concern. His one concern, Porphyry says, was to keep his eye continuously on the divine. He was definitely an ascetic. He only ate one meal every other day. He didn't care about where he slept or what clothes he wore or whatever. He would give these various teachings to people who were interested, but he didn't try to go out and proselytize in any way at all. And then he finally dies, I think at 66, I think. Anyway, and Porphyry is left with this huge stack of lectures on all kinds of things, like critiques of Aristotelian philosophy, defenses of Zoroastrianism, and all this stuff. Incredible amount of stuff. And anyway, he Porphyry, he begins to publish this or make it available, and then it begins to grow quite rapidly. Anyway, when you get to St. Augustine, if you've read The City of God or whatever, you'll see a constant mention of both Plotinus and then also Porphyry, who is Plotinus' student. Augustine is very friendly to Plotinus, a little less so to Porphyry, because Porphyry had said some derogatory things about Christianity. But Plotinus has a huge influence on Christianity. People, it's not spoken of enough, but for example, Augustine is often credited with the privation notion of evil. That's not Augustine's notion at all. In fact, Augustine doesn't even mention it because he assumes his readers are already well aware of Plotinus, that comes from Plotinus. Plotinus already had the notion of the privation notion of evil. But Augustine kind of gets credit for it in the West, and certainly he modifies it in his own way in his defense of Christianity, but it's not an original idea to Augustine. Many ideas of Augustine's are actually in Plotinus, and so it had this massive influence. Anyway, Evagrius Ponticus is also influenced by this Neoplatonic school, but not through Plotinus so much as through Origen. Again, if Origen and Plotinus both have the same teacher, Ammonius, then it's not surprising that they both have similar backgrounds. But there's some specific differences. For example, Evagrius Ponticus gets in trouble because he wrote some things in some of his writings that refer to reincarnation, so he believed in reincarnation. This is a Neoplatonistic view. Augustine does not take that view at all and fairly condemns it. But it's an interesting moment to think about early Christianity, especially of the first 200 or 300 years. Early Christianity had a lot of plurality to it. Specifically, the first early Christians were just Jews that had come up with the declaration that Jesus of Nazareth was the intended Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for. And so they took that view, but otherwise they followed the same Jewish festivals and holidays and Passovers and lived their life in a very Jewish way, except for that they affirmed that Christ had been the Messiah that was waited for, and that they weren't going to wait for another Messiah to come, especially as a king like David. But you have these other Christians. You have Gnostic Christians, you have Neoplatonistic Christians, and on and on. I think now is kind of a good time to reconsider the first couple hundred years of Christianity, because it has a lot of different varieties of people who very much believed in the teachings of Christ, but they had different views about metaphysics, that is, reality. What is the ultimate state of reality? As Christianity codifies, then you have more and more heresies, and more people's books get burned, and so forth. You're either in the club or you're out of the club. But Evagrius Ponticus is one of these sort of tragic cases, I guess, because he was somebody who had certain metaphysical views, but those didn't later accord with what the codified view was, and therefore a bunch of his books were burned and so forth. But many of his works still remain, and the ones that remain are mostly about monasticism and prayer. And he's still, considered to be very important both within Catholicism and Orthodoxy and so forth. And in fact, he's still sort of magnified less than he ought to be, because he really is the father of monasticism in the sense of writing. The first monastic is Saint Anthony, and this is very interesting. I mean, you do not have monasticism in the West. if you go back, you can go back 1,000 years BCE to prior to when the Upanishads were written, and you have these forest monks, and they're going out into the jungle and they're meditating with these mystic views of being able to conceive of the highest reality, i.e., God, and Buddhism comes out of the Indian philosophy later. Same thing. You have monastics, that is, women and men who go and live by themselves alone in order to conceive of the highest, the absolute, in a very spiritual sense. But you don't have that in the West. You have various cults. You have the pagan pictures that you see in the early Greek gods that Socrates is not so happy about, and all kinds of other various pictures. But you don't have monasticism. Saint Anthony is considered to be the first monastic of the West, and he begins this sort of exile of people who start to leave, big cities like Rome and Alexandria and stuff, and they're going out and living in the desert in little, caves or whatever, and eating one meal a day and drinking a little bit of water and spending their whole life in prayer. So it's very new. But Antony didn't write anything, and he's the first desert, quote unquote, desert father. Desert fathers are where this Western monasticism begins. And there was desert mothers too, Millennia and Sarah, and two others are specifically mentioned within the works of the desert fathers and mothers. And they went out and lived alone in caves and spent their life in prayer. And so you have this tradition beginning, and it's Evagrius Ponticus who is the first person to write on it. Most of the early desert fathers and mothers were illiterate. They were, most of them were people like shepherds, and some of them were thieves and prostitutes and stuff like that. And they changed their life around. And you can read about it. Read the Desert Fathers. Super interesting stuff. But anyway, he begins to write about various practices, and so therefore we have the reading practicos, and he begins this influence about writing about prayer as a kind of practice. Keeping in mind now what you've already read from Plato, from the Cynics, the Stoics, and so forth. You have all these techne. What is the techne of the self? Within monasticism, we have a techne of the self, and we have a new picture of the self as well. How do we perfect the self? How do we make it the best possible? How do we get the best human life? We get this through prayer, especially. But there's a discursive writing now about prayer, and it begins with Evagrius Ponticus. Arsenius, I think, is the only other major desert father that's mentioned as being well-educated, coming from a well-educated background. And he didn't write anything. Anyway, John Cassian usually gets the greatest credit because he wrote the Institutes and he wrote the conferences. And together they're like well over 1,000 pages. You can go look at them in the library. Huge. But he was the student of Evagrius Ponticus. And if you read them, you find that basically he's reiterating Evagrius Ponticus and then expanding and sort of giving commentary on stuff. And also he writes more for the monks who are dwelling together in a monastery as well, whereas Evagrius Ponticus is specifically a monastic, meaning to live entirely alone. So that's a little bit of a difference, because in the institutes and so forth, John Cassian is talking about, how a bunch of people should live together who are all monks. So he talks about, let scripture be read at the table when we sit down to eat. I mean, you don't have those kind of prescriptions given in Evagrius Ponticus because you're living alone in a cave with, one jug of water and, half a loaf of bread, and you're going to live off that for the rest of the week or whatever. So John Cassian is often credited the most with being the first writer of monasticism. He's not. The student of John Cassian is Saint Benedict, and he also is thought of a lot within this tradition, but he comes fairly late. So anyway, this is important to see. There's these earlier influences in Neoplatonism that are coloring this picture of spiritual life as being a kind of techne to the highest, i.e., God. So, not just expanding what you could possibly be as a being of sense who looks out for their own good in terms of pleasure, like an Epicurus, or a being of mind who tries to maximize positive states of consciousness, like we have in the Stoics with the notion of tranquility. Um, but actually, I mean, literally, to be able to fuse one's mind with God, to have true unity with God. This is very new, and it's different than Plotinus as well, because Plotinus's notion of God is, I guess you would call it impersonal. It's the mind can conceive of God and actually have a kind of unity with God, but Plotinus doesn't see God as being someone who knows the name of every individual on the planet and cares about them as a specific human being and is actively trying to redeem them. God is something that is available to us all for Plotinus through the mind, through meditative practices and so forth. But God is not personal like you get in Christianity. So this is very important with Christianity as a picture of self and as a picture of the best possible technique for the self, because Christianity emphasizes this redemptive factor of God, that God cares about every single person, and God wants them to be happy and wants to redeem them. God knows your name and has written your name on the palm of his hand. These kind of pictures that we get out of Judaism, but then with the figure of Christ become even further magnified. So unlike any of the views that of anyone we've read so far, the best life for the human being for the early Christians and Christianity in general and Evagrius Ponticus is one of intimacy with God, that you can actually have this kind of intimacy with God because God actively cares about you. And so to become the highest being that is possible, to exceed yourself, to enjoy bliss and so forth, becomes this beatific notion. The blessed life becomes a picture of the highest life. And this is going to stay the picture of the best life for the human being for a good 1,000 years. The medieval Middle Ages notion is this Christian notion all through the West until you get to somewhere past 1600 is usually when people approximate the beginning of the quote unquote modern era. This is the typified view that the best way to live is to live a spiritual life, to live in intimacy with God, and you can have that. You just don't have this picture, or when you read Plato and Aristotle and the Cynics and the Stoics, all of them believe in God, but they don't have this picture that God is intimate towards you. God runs the universe. God keeps all the planets in line. God works out history and keeps the atoms as they should be and all these different things. But God doesn't know what your name is and where you live, and he's not every day thinking of ways to try to redeem you, to become the possible highest person that you can be. But this intimate notion of God gives us the picture of an intimate notion of prayer. Also, you have new virtues beginning to crop up, right? In the ancient world, the Greek virtues are things like courage, endurance, self-sufficiency, andria, which is a kind of toughness or strength. They're all related around generally power, the ability, mental or physical ability, and the maximization of these things. With Christianity, you have love, humility, non-judgment, patience, contrition, that is to have a sense of remorse for the things that you've done wrong. These are not Greek virtues, they're not Roman virtues, but they become the virtues that will rule, that will be the dominant concepts of the highest good for the human being for more than 1,000 years from this point on. Evagrius Ponticus is pretty much a contemporary of St. Augustine. And in the same, pretty much around the same period, you have Constantine, the emperor himself, becoming a Christian and declaring it as such. And this is pretty profound. I mean, when you think about this, that, Christ is born 1 AD, and in 300 years, you go from having this carpenter from Galilee, who most scholars think taught for 3 years, leaving his teaching behind to 12 disciples, almost all of whom were illiterate, fishermen and other low trades like that. Going from those 12 disciples to literally just taking storm to the entire Western world until the emperor himself becomes a Christian. It's like unprecedented. Probably the closest thing that comes to it is possibly Buddhism, but I don't think that it ever spread this fast and so forth. But anyway, it'd be an interesting thing to study, but it's incredibly quick. Within 300 years or whatever, the empire is just taken by storm from these teachings from this carpenter from Galilee. And then those teachings and the philosophies that come out from them, theologies and so forth, dominate for more than 1,000 years. And so it's monumental. It's huge. So these new virtues are very important, and as you've seen before from what we've read already, they're not virtues that have existed before. They just boom, they arise. And in the early Christian world, you had this notion of metanoia, which literally means to turn around, to completely change your mind. And you have these people that, like these early desert fathers, some were thieves and murderers, and some were prostitutes and so forth. And one day they were doing that, and then the next day they metanoia. They transformed into this wholly other person, and this is happening all over the empire. And for the first 200 years, you're going to get killed just for confessing that you believe in this carpenter from Galilee. It was literally a crime, and so you have this radical shift in virtues and in values and in so forth, and people are converting despite the fact that it'll get you killed. So it's unprecedented. Anyway, so Evagrius Ponticus is writing about prayer, and what I like to think about with this, he's one of the Desert Fathers, and so he's out of this beginning school of monasticism and so forth, which says that prayer is the best and highest life for the human being, to be united with God in communication, the intimate communication. And there's kind of a duality. There's personal prayer for Evagrius Ponticus, but notice he also talks about a prayer of stillness or a prayer without images or forms. And if you know anything about this, that's the difference between the apophantic and the cataphantic notion of prayer. One is prayer that has an image in your mind, and the other is one that is without, and so forth. But anyway, prayer is the gateway to the best life, not only because we can commune with God during prayer, but the very process that, if you want to go back to talking about techne, is transformative. It changes the person so that these people who are practicing prayer become enviable people. One of the things that becomes very important about Christianity is that people, and why it probably spread so quickly, people are amazed by the fact that you have people live in poverty like the Cynics did, and wear only one piece of clothing and go around barefoot and so forth. But they're really kind people, loving people, charitable people. They give you the last crust of bread they have and do it with a smile on their face. And even before monasticism, if you read the letters of St. Paul and so forth, and you read the book of Acts, you see that these early Christians are selling all their possessions and they're living together in communities. and they're taking care of the widows and orphans and beggars and so forth, and it's part of their joy. They're not doing it because they're afraid or they're going to be punished, or they just do it out of this metanoia, this transformative process of their life, of giving up self and thinking of others first, and these notions of love and humility and so forth are transformative. So the early Christians have many of the same enviable qualities, like tranquility that the Stoics had, simple life like the Cynics, many of the virtues that you find in Platonism and so forth. Um, but without often the sophistication. People who are extremely poor and illiterate, they're living in this way that people are amazed by, even though they haven't been reading books for 20 years, like when we think about Plato, and they're not doing a bunch of practices and all these things, and they give up the amenities of life to do something for others. We don't see that in the Cynics. They're not living that way because they want to help some other person. Anyway, it was very transformative in the West, and it had some reverberations in Rome and elsewhere, until finally it subverted that Christians should be considered criminals, and the emperor, I think it's in 312, you have the Edict of Milan, and that gives tolerance to uh, Christians so that they won't be killed anymore for simply being Christians and so forth. Um, and then you have this shift where more and more people are becoming Christians, and that's happening at the time of Augustine and the time of Evagrius Ponticus. But there's conflicting views, of course, at this early stage about, with all these people coming in and now wanting to be Christians, but they don't have to die for it, whether or not that there should be a certain standard that people should live up to, like either in their practical life or in terms of their beliefs, right? And so there's controversies that have to be resolved. And Saint Augustine, again, like I said, is probably one of the great framers of Christian doctrine, because he begins to start this process of deciding what is Christian and what's not, and these different questions. People like Saint Basil writing about whether or not a person could be wealthy and still be a Christian. And anyway, you have all these different discussions that start taking place as Christianity becomes so popular that it hardly knows what to do with itself. But at the same time, the Desert Fathers had sort of recoiled back into the desert because they were very concerned that Christianity was becoming inauthentic because so many people were converting, especially people who were simply doing it as an imitation of the emperor. The emperor had become Christian, so they wanted to become Christian, but they didn't really care about the essence of Christianity. And so you find this if you read the Desert Fathers. There's a lot of people who are very antagonistic to what's going on, because they feel like the truth of Christianity is become very endangered, really, by so many people conforming to it in a very half-hearted way without sincerity. Um, anyway, um, so when we read the Practicos, one of the things that I would want you to think about while reading it is, what is Evagrius Ponticus's notion of prayer? How is it a practice, and what way is it a practice, especially when we think about the Stoics? He's using this exact same term and so forth that the Stoics use, and how is it different and how is it similar, and so forth. And you notice again he uses the word apatheia, which is just one of the most common used words within Stoicism, and he actually says that apatheia gives birth to agape, love or charity, and so he's incorporating these common notions that he knows that other educated people are aware of within, say, Stoicism or Neoplatonism, but then he's using them in a very Christian way, and he's quoting from Psalms or wherever, different Jewish or Hebrew scriptures as well, and he's incorporating these together into this notion that he has of practicing prayer, and the value of it and what it means, and the kind of prayer that can be understood, and the kind that's essentially mystic, that is, that transcends language, or what we can talk about in discursive reasoning and so forth. Um, so, I'd have you really consider, because I kind of like to do this reading after we've already looked at various techniques or different practices, and really consider how Christianity utilizes what's already come before it, and then also how it exceeds it, how it becomes something, um, more uh, than, say, the Stoics or Plato or whomever we've been reading, because certainly there is something new about Christianity, shockingly, drastically new in the Hellenistic world. Um, and not only is it new, but it has an effect. It actually transforms the landscape, um, ideologically, religiously, politically. Maybe that's one of the biggest things. Wow, all those things really shift, because of Christianity, because of you know just insane declarations like that Saint Paul makes, that we are no longer either Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, but all one in Christ Jesus. Um, wow, those, I mean, you can't get a more radical declaration. I mean, in the Roman world, there was very much a difference between being slave and free. There was very much a difference between male and female, especially politically. A woman had no political clout. A slave had no political ability that they could use. And certainly when Paul talks about Jew and Gentile, that was considered to be a very big shift. And he's just saying, no, none of those distinctions matter anymore. In fact, there's this new kind of universalization. Um, and Christianity really does introduce this notion that all people have equal value. Well, nobody thought that before. No Roman or Greek thought that, because people thought, well, what are you good at? What strengths do you have? What abilities do you have? But then all of a sudden, it's not about what you have. Your value is not given to you by whether you're good at something, whether you're stronger than someone, whether you're more intellectual or some other thing like that. It's no quality of your own, but you have intrinsic value because God gives you that value, because Christ died for every individual in the universe, including you. And so there's this new theological picture that then changes the political landscape, such that in a little while slavery will be illegal. But before, slavery had just dominated, and no matter how much people like the cynics tried to fight against it, or talk about how horrible it was, nothing really happened. I mean, you couldn't get rid of an institution like that. Most people just thought that it would never go away, that there was nothing you could do about it. And then all of a sudden, through a spiritual concept, not a political concept, the political landscape then does change, such that slavery disappears. Um, so that's pretty amazing, and also the notion of the equality of women is very much given again. Remember, I just quoted Saint Paul, who said that we're neither male nor female, meaning the distinction does not any more matter, since we are all one in Christ Jesus. Um, that again becomes a big shift. Women are given a lot more position than they had before. It's still not great, unfortunately, but it's huge. I mean, compared to what it was, and so it's interesting to think about that, and that is out of this influence of a spiritual philosophy, not out of a discursive political philosophy like you'd find in Aristotle or something like that. Um, and so it's very interesting to consider. And so, anyway, uh, the transformative practice for a person to become the highest possible person they can become for Christianity for the next 1,000+ years is going to be intimacy with God. The more you know God, the more you're in connection or have a relationship towards God, uh, the more you become the fullness of the possible human being that you are. And you already have value, it's not that you have to work or get value. You have value in God's eyes, but I think, especially through prayer, you have to come to learn to accept that value, because mostly we just look around and we think of whether other people think that we're great or whether they think we have value. But again, in the spiritual notion, it's not about whether you're good looking or whether you have money or whether you have certain talents or you're physically strong or you're male or female or slave or free or whatever. None of those things, again, are what gives you value. You find that value when you actually understand that God both exists and cares for you. And God is not a being who simply keeps the universe in order, but a being who knows your name, who is trying to give you back your value, which you already have, by you accepting it. But that acceptance is somewhat of a process, since actually we're the ones that are so recalcitrant to accept it, because we see ourselves as worthless. And so we never perceive our value because of that. Again, if you remember the Gospels, Christ says these things like, if you had as much faith as the seed of mustard, you could say to a mountain, be torn up and be cast into the sea, and it would be done. And then, of course, Christ performs these different miracles, and then not only he, but his disciples perform miracles and so forth. This is given as a kind of living proof that human beings have literally miraculous ability, but they don't hold claim to it because they don't understand their true inheritance. That is, that we are sons and daughters of God. We don't think that we are, and so therefore we lack that faith that's even as big as the seed of mustard, which, if you know what a mustard seed is, tiny little speck of a seed. It's very tiny. But if we had some faith in God first, we could have faith in ourselves. And so this is very important, especially when you read Augustine, not so much in Evagrius Ponticus because he's writing about practices and so forth, but certainly in St. Augustine, that whole problem of sophrosyne, that whole problem of self-control and how do we get it, for Augustine, gets answered through God. I mean, he's living in an era where there's Stoics everywhere and people like that, and they're trying to practice these different practices. They want to have sophrosyne, they want to have control of itself, but they suck at it. They're doing a horrible job, but they're trying. And so Augustine kind of asks, like, well, why is it that we try so hard and fail so often? And he thinks the reason why is because we're looking the wrong way around. So that instead of trying to change ourselves through ourselves, we need to look towards God. And out of that reflection of looking towards God, the transformative process is actually done for us or given to us, such that we become, if you want to put it this way, angels or saints while living. But we don't do it through ourselves. We do it through the transformative grace of God, which is eminent because God cares about us. God is not indifferent to us. So these things are important because, we looked at sophrosyne. The sophrosyne is the problem. Like, well, how do I deal with these desires that I do have, but I know they're causing a wreck in my life, but I can't get rid of them. I can't get rid of these addictive desires. And I have the education model, and I do these practices, and I, do try keeping all these things, and yeah, I just fail and fail and fail. St. Augustine's notion is that if you want to be transformed, you have to realize that you are a son or daughter of God, and it's God that ultimately transforms us, and makes us the maximum of what we can be, which is higher than anyone can possibly even conceive of. And that further than that, when we die, we, in a sense, inherit the true maximality of ourselves that in our fallen state we only have glimpses of. And so there's this different picture of the self now, a picture of the self which is not biological alone like in Epicurus, and not as a dualism as in Plato, and not as various states of consciousness for the Stoics. The Stoics didn't believe in immortality of the soul anyway. But this new picture of the self as being beings who can be intimate with God and be transformed by God and have infinite power if we allow ourselves to be humble enough to receive it and so forth. These are all very transformative notions, and I hope you see that they're very new in this world that we've been reading from. They're shockingly different, and many of them come out of Judaism. If you really study the Psalms and you study the story of Abraham and David and the Torah, you get some of these pictures, obviously, the of God as intimate. Certainly, God is intimate in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and so forth. But Christianity, I think, maximizes, kind of elevates the notion even more on a certain level, and so um, it's very new, um, and it changes the entire landscape. Um, anyway, I think it's fun to read Evagrius Ponticus. I think he's a nice guy to read in a pluralistic age of Christianity. To go back and look at the early Christians of the first 200 years and see that there were a lot of different perspectives and a lot of points of view, and people could believe a lot of different things, especially early on, without being called heretics. And Evagrius Ponticus is one of those people. I mean, I think when we think about comparative religion today, Evagrius Ponticus is somebody to write interesting papers about in terms of uh, East-West comparison and so forth. That some of his notions of prayer sound almost like a Buddhist notion of meditation, and some of the things that he believed in were more like a Hindu or a Buddhist and so forth because of this Neoplatonist influence and so forth. But he was also very much an outstanding example of a Christian, and so it's very interesting, I think, to consider how there was a lot of different pictures of Christianity early on, and how those pictures that sometimes we forget actually shaped Christianity the way maybe we even conceive it today, but we don't always understand those influences because we don't go back and read the history and so forth. Um, anyway, I think that's kind of the essence of what I wanted to say. Just definitely keep in mind how Evagrius Ponticus is a extension of the notions of practice that we've had before, but in a new way, and that this is going to last all the way up to the quote-unquote modern era. That's who we're going to read next. We're going to read Kant. We see that at this point there's a shift away from religion towards politics. That's going to be the notion we see, especially in Kant. No longer looking for answers within spiritual metaphysics, but starting to think about answers in a political way, in this kind of Enlightenment rationalist tradition and so forth. But all the way until that point, I mean, Kant is writing in the 1700s, where there's still, this maximal influence of Christianity. Christianity stays strong. It is the influence of the West for an insane amount of time, long lasting. So this picture of prayer, this picture of God, and so forth, is the dominant influence that stays with us for all this time. All right, I hope you're all staying healthy and happy and well, and I'll try and get that next lecture on Kant to you next Monday. So try to keep this doing every Monday, post one. All right, take care.